Welcome to the Economist Next Door, a podcast where we make complex economic ideas accessible. No PhD required.
It's important to create an economy that fosters people's choices to own a home if they want to, rent if they want to, live in a boat if they want to. But the important point is that they don't feel constrained by their economic situation. So tariffs take choices away from people.
Welcome to the Economist Next Door, an economics podcast for everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about one of the teams here at the American Institute for Economic Research, Defending Freedom, Combating Collectivism. It's quite a mouthful. We call it DFCC, but we're going to be talking about why we have that team, what it's about. This is the team I'm a part of primarily as well, but I'm joined by some of my colleagues on this team. I'm excited for you to get to know the people I work with and who are fighting for your economic liberties and for human flourishing. Let's get started. So the Defending Freedom, Combating Collectivism, to give you a sense of what it is before I invite my guests to join in here, is our team melds moral and philosophical concerns with economic theory and logic. And the reason the institution created this team is several years ago, we saw this rise in collectivist sentiment, this idea that everything should be shared or mashed together, that we have this sort of political solidarity. And we saw problems with this on both sides of the political aisle, on the left, but then also increasingly on the right. And so on the left, this collectivism can be seen in things like the environmental social governance movement, where you have a lot of manipulation of what companies are supposed to do along ESG kinds of criteria, or what more people are familiar with is the diversity, equity, inclusion movement, the DEI. People need to have representation based on their skin color or sexual orientation. And then, of course, collectivism most historically is known for advocating, radical redistribution of property. So you think about like Karl Marx, socialism, taxing the rich, confiscating wealth from the rich, redistributing it to the poor. Or really, it's more politically connected, but we'll get into that. But there's this issue that collectivists have always wanted on the left to try to do this. But increasingly, we see collectivism on the right, and this is a relatively new phenomenon or recent one in terms of national industrial policy. Much of this is couched in terms of national defense or manufacturing being hollowed out. And you see Republicans arguing for subsidies for certain kinds of industries, trade restrictions, restricting trade between countries as a means of promoting employment, promoting industry, certain kinds of industrial development or employment growth. And what we also see, I think, in this collectivism is a kind of fast tracking of large companies. So there's a lot of, we're going to fast track this industry, this company, we're going to get this deal together. In both cases, whether we're talking about the left or the right, something that our team is concerned about is the potential for cronyism, for benefiting one's friends at the expense of everyone else, and the possibility of what we might call regulatory capture, where increasingly the more government is involved in markets, the more likely it is that business leaders will try to use the government to benefit themselves, to punish their competitors, and at the end of the day, everybody, the consumer especially, suffers. So those are some of the issues we're going to jump into. One more thing I'll mention about this team and what we're trying to do, the philosophical dimension, is we also care about civil society, about culture, and about human flourishing more broadly. And obviously, economics and material well-being is a big part of that. But we care about family formation. We care about freedom to exercise religion. We care about social interaction. And so we worry about human flourishing as well as sort of economic efficiency and government accountability. So with that introduction, let me welcome my guests on, and they're going to share a little bit about their background and how they got interested in economics in general and their work on this team in particular. And we're just going to spend some time talking about some of the big picture stuff that we work on. So I'm joined today by Dave Hebert, who's a senior research fellow on the DFCC team, as well as Julia Cartwright, who's senior research fellow on this team, and with a particular focus on law and economics. And we'll get into that a little bit in terms of that particular focus there. Thank you both for joining me. And let's just take a couple minutes. You can kind of share whatever you want, but how did you get to where you are today in terms of being at AIER, this DFCC team, and sort of things that you're thinking about or that you're excited about in terms of getting to work on every day? Dave, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Julia.
Yeah, thanks, Paul, so much for having us on today and giving us this opportunity to talk about stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, you know, economics was just that subject that brought kind of everything that I was really interested in under one umbrella. So I started off in college as a math major, and I wanted to be a high school math teacher. So, you know, education was always important to me. Math was really interesting to me. I especially liked geometry and all the proofs and the triangle rules and everything. But it turns out there's just not a whole lot you can do as a math major.
Right.
There's a lot more than people think, but it's limiting in some regard. And you don't get to talk about the big questions. You know, who are we? Why are we here? What are we doing? Right. And economics, at least the way that we did it, you know, at Hillsdale, as you know, is that, you know, you get to answer those big questions. So, you know, I majored in economics. I went off to graduate school, got my PhD, taught for a little while. And then after a few years of teaching, I needed a change. And as it turns out, AIER was hiring. You were here. You know, I've known you for 20 years at this point. Sam was here. I've known him for 15 years from his previous work. And it just kind of was this perfect opportunity for a new chapter in my life and a new challenge and a new opportunity.
So, great. Well, and we'll go into like the specific stuff that you've been doing and get to do here that you can pursue even better than being, say, a professor, working with students day in and day out. Good. So we'll return to that. Julie, how about you? Your introduction to economics or how you got into the field?
Thank you for having me, Paul. Great to be with you too, Dave. Our great team here. I started my interest in economics at home. My parents are super nerds. Both of them are engineers and kind of lifelong learner types. And I grew up watching the Milton Friedman Free to Choose series. And I knew I was going into full nerddom when I enjoyed the part after the Milton Friedman series, which was the question and answer with different scholars. I don't know if either of you have seen that. But it was a debate where he would bring on scholars of other disciplines or maybe perspectives. And when I was younger, I kind of would skip that part. But then as I got a little older, I really enjoyed that part. And I liked how economics adds a lot of objectivity to things that people think are subjective. And I got a little bit interested in politics and economics. And I started at the University of San Diego with an economics degree and a math minor. And I will never forget my Econ 101 class with my professor, Stephen Conroy. Shout out to him. He absolutely changed my life. He took our class to Tijuana, Mexico, and introduced us to microfinance. So how to use economic tools to alleviate poverty and also empower entrepreneurship. So I started an economics microfinance club at USD and would just try to recruit random students by getting them excited about this. We had all these different events, and I would just experiment with how to articulate these ideas to my fellow peers and students. We got involved with the San Diego Microfinance Alliance, which was very informative. We would meet with different microfinance borrowers and hear their stories. And we took a trip to Jamaica, and we actually got 501c3 status. So we were able to make our own microloans as college students, which was a lot of fun. And that led my interest into economic research. And I wrote my undergrad dissertation on microfinance based on this firm that I was working with and for. And that just kind of grew and grew. And I decided to get my PhD in economics. And I've loved articulating economic ideas to everybody from the random Uber driver to students and colleagues, professionals, congressmen and women. So that's been a lot of fun. I was an academic for 8 years and thoroughly enjoyed that, but have made the pivot recently to AIER and my endeavors to become a public intellectual. So that is what led me here.
Excellent. Well, we're all kind of on this journey together. So maybe you could share a little bit, Dave, we'll come back to you, in terms of what are some of the things you've written about or worked on in the last year, you know, in terms of things you've written, you studied, or that you've been informing people about? What are a couple things that come to mind that you think have been important and fun to work on and talk about?
Yeah, so it's hard for me to not just jump straight to tariffs. That's been that's the year of the tariffs. The year of the tariff.
It's been busy.
Yeah, well, it's always fun. So I remember when I interviewed, you know, Sam told me that he wanted us to write about tariffs, and I distinctly remember telling him, "Well, that's a bad idea. Everyone already agrees that tariffs are horrible. That's policy. You know, I'm going to get like I'll get 1 or 2 publications out of this, and that'll be it. You know, here we go, right? But you know, 18 months later, here I am still writing about it. So yeah, I do a lot of that. And then the other area that I'm pushing on lately is understanding the incentives that politicians face. And specifically, they always tend to push on sort of the wrong side of the market, if you will. So when there's a shortage, they always emphasize, oh, there's not enough of this to go around. We better help the buyers buy more. Right. And then what happens when you do that, when you push the demand curve out and you don't address supply, price goes up. Right. And so then
when there's a surplus, you have too much of something, let's subsidize it more.
Right. Yeah. If there's a surplus, like we can't sell, enough of our product at a high enough price. Well, let's do price, mandates. Right. And we'll solve it that way. It's like, well, wait a minute. All right, you're just pushing on exactly the wrong side. Right. You're restricting supply and then complaining about high prices. Well, that's not correct.
Right.
So once you understand the incentives that policymakers face, why they do that makes sense. It's still not the correct thing for them to try to do if they're really trying to solve the problem. But the problem that they're trying to solve is, how do I get more votes?
I was about to say, so would you say, and maybe you can define this, would you say that there are a lot more rents to be had by pushing on the wrong side of the market?
So there certainly are rents to be had. I think it also comes down to just how visible it is. So, when a single mom can't afford, housing, you give her money and say, here, you can use this to buy housing. And to be clear, I'm not opposed to single moms having housing. So to be very crystal clear about that one. But when you do that, when you continuously do that and you expand the number of people that you're going to try to help buy a house by giving them cheaper access to mortgages, what ends up happening is people get more mortgages and they buy more houses.
Yep.
But a mortgage doesn't build a house, right? Construction workers build houses. And so you're not going to unleash that entrepreneur to build houses, when you're not going to unleash the ability through zoning reform to actually construct the houses that people want and need, especially as starter homes, then you're going to get into a problem where housing is unaffordable. And the problem isn't that the price is high. The price is high because there's no or lack of supply. If we could address the supply, we would address the price. Everything would take care of itself that way.
That's right. Yeah, and it's to talk a little inside shop here, but we'll explain it for the readers. This is an example of this powerful idea that Gordon Tullock talks about called the transitional gains trap, where you basically create an immediate solution for something. So someone doesn't have enough money to buy whatever. Well, we'll just give them more money to buy it. And the transitional gains trap is that you help them very briefly for a moment, but the force that you unleash is you actually create more buying power in the market, which drives up the price, which then means more people can no longer afford it. We see this with higher education. We see this with healthcare. We see this often with housing. And this is why it's so important to kind of go back to these sort of first principles to think through, well, what is the actual problem here? Is it a lack of money, or is it this lack of affordability that's driven by constraints on the market? So that's a great point. I'll just very briefly, I'm about to come to you, Julia. On the tariffs, I remember like Liberation Day happened and I was doing media hits like every day for like a week or two of like, people, what the heck is going on? And it was a busy time, and then there's still stuff. And we should come back to tariffs, because this is actually, ironically, a very controversial point in many circles, that now we're the old orthodoxy, right? The dinosaurs who haven't gotten with the program. So we should spend some time unpacking that a little bit. But Julie, tell me a little bit about what you've worked on over the last couple months, last year, because you joined us last year, what you've been thinking about, both in terms of talking to people, informing them about, and maybe what you're interested in at the moment.
Yeah, one of the big things I've been focusing on is housing and different laws that lay a lot of our housing regulations and what is perhaps prohibitive to building. I used to live in the West LA area, and with the fires that happened just a year ago in the Pacific Palisades and in Malibu, that sparked horrible pun there, but not pun intended at all.
Unintended.
But sparked interest in looking at what is prohibiting a lot of the housing rebuild in that area. There was just last year, just a handful, I think fewer than 100 permits that were actually issued for rebuilding, and over 16,000 structures had been destroyed. So there is a huge issue with just red tape not allowing people to rebuild. So I did quite a bit of work on housing policy and housing regulation, kind of with that California focus. And I currently now live in Texas, which is a lot more friendly to housing. And so kind of juxtaposing those as well and looking at different state regulations and how that just manifests itself in very different situations as far as people's ability to secure property rights, be able to wield them effectively, be able to adapt even with what they're rebuilding. I know there's a lot of, or just to give a few examples, but in the Los Angeles area, height restrictions are very draconian. Also, parking restrictions, environmental laws are very draconian. LA, of course, is not known for rolling back regulations, but there was so much pressure on the state that they actually did roll back one of Reagan's signature laws, which was these various environmental laws in California, because even the folks on the left there were saying this is just way too arduous to do this giant environmental study to try to rebuild a single family home, for example.
Is that the Coastal Commission that they were paring back, like the Coastal Commission regulatory apparatus?
So I know they are a little bit. The California Coastal Commission is just about as draconian as it gets, but it was actually the California environmental, some of their signature laws that were written in the 70s.
Okay.
Those really laid the foundation for a lot of the environmental review that everybody has to do.
Were they, sorry, just to kind of dig in this, were they temporarily suspended or suspended for this particular areas, or are they actually like reforming and rolling back the regulation entirely?
They are working on reforming the regulation entirely.
Okay.
And they're doing that somewhat piecemeal, but they are focusing on that environmental study and trying to reform it. Yep.
To make it easier to build houses. And it's remarkable how few houses have been built or even started more than a year or around a year later.
Yep.
And say maybe a little bit about, again, you have this lived experience of living in LA and now living in Texas. Like, what do you see in terms of vibrancy, growth, in the city where you are, in Texas in general, and what kind of implications does that have for people's quality of life and opportunity to live in a place where it's much easier to build houses and they're more affordable?
Yeah, great question. If you ask your average late 20s to late 30s person in LA, I would say just a tiny fraction of them actually own their home. Most of them are living in apartments or townhomes and they're renting and they just feel very trapped. I actually decided to do real estate investment out of state when I lived in LA because the price point was just so high to enter the market. And I was even making decent money at the time. And you pretty much have to be a multimillionaire to secure even the smallest home. So just on the general milieu, now that I'm just thinking out loud, it kind of relates to the culture of LA. It's Neverland, meaning people just don't grow up there. And I know that's but is a huge impact on that. But I think a big aspect of it, now that I'm just articulating this out loud, is the fact that people just don't feel like they can get into any type of home ownership.
Right.
Whereas in Texas, it is just the opposite. Yeah. You will meet people who are 21 years old, with buying a house and making that a really important part of their next step of life. And it's almost comical how much building is going on. I mean, I'll just drive around my neighborhood and see just a patch of grass and think to myself, well, that's going to be developed in about, 4 months. So the energy is just, you get this energy of possibility and kind of this unstoppableness more in a place that just, you don't feel so stifled by that. And I know there's a lot of argument to whether or not housing is a next step to the American dream, but a lot of people just see it that way. And if you're not able to take that next step, you're less likely to devote yourself to a long-term relationship. You're less likely to really put roots down in the community. So that has a lot of knock-on effects on just the overall culture of LA.
No, that's really good. And David, why don't you add on to that in terms of your thoughts on like California? It amazes me that California hangs on with all its problems. How does it still function? And so we could talk about like some of the cultural factors she was talking about, and then also like how is LA like still a thing and people are there in California, and then what do you see going on in terms of the political economy and the cultural issues that are going on here?
Yeah, well, I think, Julia hit the nail on the head by pointing out you have sort of a not quite transient culture in LA, but a less permanent one, right? And people are moving even within LA. So even within the communities in Los Angeles, there's not those deep, long roots that, you might know your neighbor or be able to rely on them for, civil society in any way, shape, and form, right? And like you said, a lot of it comes down to housing restrictions and the inability of people to just get into a house that they own, that they can invest in, that they can sort of garner that feeling of accomplishment, of taking care of something. So, just the other day, right, I replaced a fan in my bedroom, right? And it's a
knowledgeable and handy.
handy is certainly a word. So we'll tell you that my father-in-law, who was a contractor, did 99% of the work. No, but that sense of pride to be like, oh yeah, I turned the switch on and like the work spins, right? And like the light bulb's not spinning; it's the fan blades that are spinning. This is amazing, right?
Yeah.
And you miss out on that when you're just renting. And I say just as if it's like a bad thing, but there's just a certain element of growing up that happens when you can do those sorts of repairs, or you can choose what color fan to have in your house, right? You can't do that when you're renting as easily. So I do think that that's a big factor, right? And at the end of the day, we're always about people living healthily and wealthily. But the important thing that I think our vertical focuses on is, however someone else chooses to define those terms.
Right.
I'm not going to tell you what healthy and lovely is.
Right.
You tell me.
Well, and we could spend all our time talking about this, but maybe we can touch on it a little bit, because I think on both sides there's concern about affordability, but I think especially on the right of the political spectrum, there's a lot of conversation about family formation, stability, and many of them point to, well, actually it's more of a manufacturing job wage issue,
Right.
as opposed to a bad regulatory or bad zoning issue. So what would you say to, folks on the right who say, oh yeah, I want that. I want more rootedness. I want people to be able to buy houses and form families, but free trade. I mean, this opens up a whole bunch of can of worms, but free trade has kind of hollowed out manufacturing, or there aren't as many good jobs. And so we need to have industrial policy and tax policy that's tailored to encouraging people to form families, to own their own home, to, have this rootedness. How would you begin to respond to someone like that? What sorts of things are they maybe missing, or how would you maybe nuance that answer? Julie, what would you say?
Yeah, great question. And just to kind of piggyback off our conversation about housing, you see tons of people renting in Texas, even though they can, in a specific area, oftentimes afford a home. So home ownership is a lot more attainable. And that being said, it's the economic freedom component. With choice, people can decide what's important to them, as both of you have noted. So I would, just to address many of those points that you, this could be a 4-hour long podcast if we want to go into all those, but on just the lifestyle front, it's important to create an economy that fosters people's choices to, own a home if they want to, rent if they want to, live on a boat if they want to. But the important point is that they don't feel constrained by their economic situation, that it doesn't allow them to make that next either personal step or career step or something like that. So tariffs, those take choices away from people just very simply. And oftentimes this industrial policy is just so hyper-focused on these type of industries that can garner rents from the government and get special favors and get specific carve-outs. So I would suggest and invite people to look at the other aspects of what's being missed if you are specifically focusing on these firms. Steel tariffs, for example, there has been a lot of work done in Trump administration one about the impact of the tariffs on steel. It saved about 1,000 jobs in the steel industry, a few thousand jobs here and there. There are these huge knock-on effects of all these other industries that purchase steel that were actually really hurt by this. My family's big into brewing, and the brewers got really hurt by this because the steel tanks that they brew a lot of their beer in just skyrocketed. I know Dave has done work on the size of cans that has been impacted by steel prices. So to broaden the conversation of how do we open our eyes to economic freedom more broadly, and this is going to be where we cut red tape, where we allow people to trade, whether it's with the person down the road or the person in Bangladesh, thousands of miles away. That's going to enable not only people to materially be more free, but also open up a lot more choices on the social, moral, family side of things too.
No, that's great. And Dave, I want to bring you in here, but let me just throw this added nuance to it. We talk about collectivism on the left and the right. And I think a lot of people on the right I think if you explain collectivism to them, they'd be like, oh, well, I don't really like that. But then when you say tariffs are kind of collectivist, they'd be like, what are you talking about? So maybe you could comment on how are tariffs collectivist or really redistributivist, and how are they really actually very similar to like what somebody like Mamdani wants to do with housing or other sorts of things. So with that kind of twist, what would you add?
So tariffs, what they're really trying to do is say, if you would just be willing to pay more to support your fellow Americans, then everyone can have a job, a better wage, everyone will be happy, right? And the Rust Belt will become the Platinum Belt or whatever, or probably Gold Dip at this point, right? And so, it's really just a call on the American people to say, if you really care about your fellow Americans, you'll buy local or you'll buy American.
Exactly. Why are you so fixated on cheap stuff?
Right.
Trump shockingly saying you'd only need a few dollars.
Yeah, you need $3, not $37, right? But where it fails to me is if you look. So I will never dispute that the Rust Belt has suffered tremendous economic harm. Like that seems true, and that does have knock-on effects on family formation, on livelihood, just in general, right? That's certainly true. But what they're missing is answering the question of, why is that community so dependent on that one factory? Like if that factory suffers, that community goes under, right? Why is it that way? And what you find when you look through that town's history or through the state's history or whatever, what you find is that in the 80s, 70s, sometimes 60s, 90s, in the past, basically, there was a protectionist policy that propped up that factory or that industry in that area. Well, the ground around them is eroding, and you're putting that industry up on this pedestal, right? And you can only elevate it for so long before it just becomes not just too expensive, but too costly in terms of economics and like the foregone everything, right? And so what happens is this industry in that town gets put on this pedestal. Everyone works there or in a very adjacent, arena. And when that falters, there's nothing in that region for them to fall back on. And so they're forced to either accept, being an Amazon delivery driver, which there's nothing wrong with being an Amazon delivery driver, but go tell that to, an assembly line worker who worked, assembling cars for 40 years and is making a good wage, that now he's got to go be a delivery driver or he's driving for Uber, right? These are all, great opportunities. I will never say that they're not, but when you lose that job you've been doing for 40 years, a part of your identity is lost. Like you have that identity. Like the hardest part of coming to AIER is I could no longer say I was a professor. And that's a costly thing. Imagine a factory worker that now has to say, I'm not working on the line, I'm driving a car.
Right.
That's a totally different thing. And so that to me is the thing is it's doubling down on policy we've already tried. And that has led to the very problems we're trying to solve by doubling down on the problematic policy.
Yeah, there's so much in what you said. I think maybe a couple points to highlight is, one, I think there's a great deal of underappreciation of the kind of red tape and regulations, whether national, but also very much local, that hamstrung a lot of communities in the Midwest and made them less competitive than they need to be because of government restrictions on whether it's zoning or subsidies or other kinds of favoritism. And that I don't see talked about as much as, we'd like to see it talked about. Another thing you mentioned is this idea of change involves loss. And part of, as sort of pro-market people, Joseph Schumpeter, a famous economist, talked about the market process being creative destruction, that there's creation and destruction going on. And that has costs and there's challenges to that. And part of what we want to think about is not just, well, do we gain some dollars at the end of it, but how do people flourish in that kind of system? How do they have opportunity and meaning? How do we think about that? And so the final thing I'll say, kind of based on your comments here, is that I find it ironic that protectionist mentality and a tariff mentality is actually extremely defeatist, right? It's sort of, we're not good enough. We can't compete. We can't. And the irony is that if you look in small markets or in large global markets, competition actually makes firms better.
Right.
So, you're well aware of this, but part of why the Midwest suffered, and especially the automotive industry suffered, is because they were kind of coddled for decades. And then we opened it up to trade and they just weren't as good as Toyota and Honda. And now we're kind of have this sort of closing again in certain ways with trade. And the concern is, well, we're going to start like the advocates say, well, we're going to build our whatever industry or manufacturing, but actually we're very likely going to be coddling it.
Right. But you're going to inculcate the very patterns they have right
Exactly.
now.
They become complacent. You see this with U.S. Steel. Right. Not being as good as other kinds of steel companies.
Right.
And this is, again, some of the second and third order effects that we want to think about when it comes to trade.
Well, and our EVs now are not competitive because we're not letting a lot of Chinese imports into the U.S. because we're afraid that we're just going to be completely flattened.
Exactly. And so there is this, there's a lot of fear behind this, which is ironic because, you know, if you think about the Trump administration, they're sort of being very muscular, like, you know, America first, America's great. And I'm all for that. But there is, I think, something problematic in this sort of like closedness when they want to say, we're going to unleash AI, we're going to unleash energy, we're going to, you know, deregulate. The protectionism just doesn't fit very well, I think, from an intellectual standpoint.
Yeah. Well, it is, like you said, it's a defeatist mentality. It's saying that you cannot succeed unless I protect you.
That's right.
The other people.
Yeah.
And that's just not who I am. I believe in the American people.
That's right.
Maybe I'm strange.
No, I think you're not alone in that. Well, let's shift gears here slightly, kind of to zoom out. So we're talking about tariffs and housing, but taking a step back, what do you think is kind of the big picture for the U.S. economy and American society when it comes to collectivism? What are some of the big things that are going on, the themes, the trends, when you think about where's the economy at, where's society at, what sorts of issues are we seeing? Zoom out maybe, you know, this year, or think about like on a yearly or maybe a couple year kind of trend. Where do you think we're at on this? Julia, what do you think? What are some of the big trends or issues you see when it comes to collectivism in the economy?
Sure. I think a great quote that really kicked off our year, January 1st, 2026, was Zoran Mamdani's mayoral speech, where he said, we want to shake off, I think he said something along the lines of the cold of rugged individualism for the warmth of collectivism. And that has been, I think, really striking. I mean, religious leaders have spoken up against it, but you see people saying, wait a minute, I didn't really necessarily define myself as a rugged individualist, but something about that quote has really resonated with people and said, hold on, I thought that was somewhat part of the American identity. So I see this being just going forward this year is this search for American identity. Like, what exactly does collectivism mean?
Right.
Do we all, and I am going to butcher exactly who this was, that someone on Mamdani's team was talking about how especially white folks have to orient themselves with respect to their knowledge about what private property means.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's, whoa, where are we going from there? And I see us having a huge conversation in 2026 about what exactly does this mean? Because I think a lot of people have been snoozing. And what's interesting, I saw this interview with an immigrant, and she said, you know what you actually have to do as an immigrant? You have to take a test. And one of the questions on the test, the correct answer is against communism. She said that is part of becoming an American citizen. So I think because we have been so, just our generation and generations just around us have been so insulated from the impacts of communism, where, you know, boomers and folks from the Eastern Bloc have definitely felt it a lot more than I think your average middle-aged American person. I think we're going to start having to see this. And we see these experiments run in New York. We're seeing experiments run in California about what exactly does that mean. So I see a huge conversation with that. I love the federalism of the United States because states like Florida, states like Texas, other Western states, Montana, Idaho, are saying, hey, these other very poor economic policies just create this amazing opportunity for us to show the way of how to do economic policy and truly embrace a lot of choice and economic freedom. That was somewhat of a circuitous way.
No, it's good. I mean, I like that idea, that like the idea of identity, I think, is really important and tied into economy, forming families, distribution of wealth, and the laboratories of democracy is an important idea as well. So that's good. Dave, what would you add, or what do you see?
Yeah, so I agree on the identities front. I think what we're also going to see is people maybe realizing that the dividing lines in the country really are becoming the politically well-connected and the not politically well-connected, right? So there's, you know, always those jokes about, you know, your enemy's not the rich, it's the people that know someone in Washington, D.C., right? And that's the one that we need to really kind of focus on. And I think people have chuckled and seen that and said, oh yeah, that's true. But I really think what we're seeing now is that that's like really true. And it's like overtly true. You know, if there's one thing about this new administration is that they are anything but subtle. And it's very clear that I think a lot of Americans are realizing that who you know mattering more than what you know and how good you actually are. that's problematic for a number of reasons. And I think people are starting to realize that that's become the name of the game. Now, whether that's because of education or, what's going on, I don't know. We'll have to explore that some more too. But yeah.
Well, a great blessing, frankly, of the Trump administration is he is just talking about what's typically done behind closed doors. So the fact that he had a huge falling out with Elon Musk personally, and now he's threatening SpaceX's different contracts.
Yeah.
That's a perfect example of exactly what you're talking about with the political connectedness. And I think people are seeing this a lot more clearly than before.
Right.
And I think that has a great opportunity for us to even further point that out and also mention, hey, yes, this is happening very overtly in our faces right now, but this has really been happening for as long as politics has existed.
That's right. No, I do highlight that people who are really concerned about it and say, the Biden administration was doing a lot of, throttling things and threatening and monitoring, and it's part of the political apparatus. It's not, I think the Trump administration is sort of showing it's not just a left-right issue. It's sort of a political issue. And to both of your points, I think areas where I see this problem of favoritism, and again, it has to do with this collectivist bent, right? Where we're going to centralize power or make political determinations about which companies are going to succeed or industries are going to grow. And the problem with this is Friedrich Hayek and others have written about, is when resources are directed through politics, those with political power are going to decide not based on need or merit, but based on who they know, who they like, their friends, their family. And I think we see this a lot. And I think it's probably going to be bad news for the Republicans in the midterms, where Trump has promised this sort of widespread prosperity, but he's actually really focused on concentrated prosperity. So you see the large tech companies are doing amazing, right? Where they're able to, they're what the administration is doing in part is suspending certain regulations for the big tech companies or for the
bailing out Intel.
For the big companies or for building data centers, but they're not actually rolling back the regulation for everyone. I mean, they are doing some deregulation, which is good, but they're often just sort of suspending it for certain companies. And then you see the kinds of deals that Trump makes. We're going to get, $1 trillion from this country, well, who's that going to go to? It's not going to be sort of dispersed evenly in the economy. It's going to go to large partnership with large companies. And so we see this kind of tale of two economies of large corporate entities doing very well and the stock market doing well, but a lot of other people that we kind of alluded to, people at breweries or people in like small scale industry or manufacturing, that are actually in some ways footing the bill indirectly, because they're the ones who are paying the tariffs and who are being harmed by this. Because by definition, when you have tariffs and protectionism, you are favoring some industries and harming other industries, favoring some groups, harming other groups. And it's really, in many ways, redistributive. And I think if you said that to people about tariffs, who are pro-tariff, either they wouldn't believe you or they would be like a little bit taken aback of, well, wait a second, I don't believe in redistribution. Right.
Well, and I think a perfect example of what you're talking about, Paul, is the fact that the Trump administration posited the fact that he might do tariff redistribution checks.
That's right. Yep.
Because clearly,
to those who are poor.
Exactly. So he wouldn't feel the pressure to do that if everybody felt that they were benefiting from tariffs, but people are feeling the prosperity, quote unquote, that's being felt from tariffs is not widespread. So he's saying, hey, see, I'm now giving everybody a reason to be a proponent of tariffs, even though you might not have felt it in your own industry or in the things that you buy every day.
Absolutely. And I think that's part of what we're thinking about. And so maybe as we are getting ready to wrap here, thinking through, the rest of this year, what sorts of things are you looking forward to writing on or trying to develop more? Stuff about kind of the high level stuff, but do you have plans or thoughts on some things you're going to look into or write about, or things maybe that our listeners, people are just going about their ordinary lives. They're not economists. They're not, in the weeds like us every day, but what should they be, kind of keeping an eye out for, thinking about? So there's kind of two parts to that. What are you interested in? And then are there any kind of big picture things you think people should kind of keep an eye on as we go through this year?
Yeah, so the first thing I'm really interested in working more on this year is AI. So it's a brand new technology. It's going to be everywhere. There's a lot of debate about whether we're in a bubble right now and if that bubble's going to burst and what it's going to do in the energy sector, and there's a whole bunch there. But what I'm really interested in seeing is not so much how it affects jobs directly. That's what everyone's covering. But really, it's the indirect, how is AI going to change education and learning, right? Are we going to finally get away from this, rote memorization model that the three of us probably participated in more than we wanted to because it's easier? Or are we going to move into a project-based, learning environment where, kids are in charge of what they want to learn and they develop the tools and the knowledge that they need to accomplish that task?
And will this break the teacher union strike?
Will this break the teacher union strikes? I'm very interested in that. Obviously, I'm also going to be following the tariffs very closely and the Supreme Court's rulings. What responses, if any, the Trump administration has to those. My suspicion is that they're going to get struck down, but I've been wrong plenty of times in the past, so we'll find out together.
All right. Sounds good.
I'm focused a lot on the administrative state, specifically how the administrative state has been rewired in the crypto space. So a lot of power has been taken away from the SEC through the Clarity Act and the Genius Act. Also, the Anti-Central Bank Digital Currency Act is going to be voted on this year. That's going to be huge. So the rewiring of the role the administrative state plays in crypto, the Biden administration was referenced as a crypto winter in this space. So we've seen a huge revitalization of this sector. Also, the administrative state's impact in housing and also in energy policy. I'm looking a lot in. The U.S. is embracing nuclear, and actually January 7th, 2026, I don't know exactly when this is going to air, but there's a hearing on nuclear energy policy, which would not have been anything on the table 5-6 years ago. So this is a huge advent for the United States to go into 2026. I'm also going to be watching a lot of the post-Chevron rulings about the administrative state's role in deciding how regulation can be set and ruled upon. So those are kind of the big things I'm looking forward to. Oh, and one last thing. As we may have heard a little bit, the Somali fraud scandal in Minnesota has really ballooned a lot of different fraud that's happening in a lot of different entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. People are really starting to poke holes in fraud going on in California, New York, Illinois primarily. So I'm going to be looking at that and specifically the role that the administrative state is playing in fraud.
Man, all these are good. We have a lot of content for future podcasts. I mean, I think just on the fraud note too, one of the things you have to ask about collectivism and collectivists is, for collectivists, is the fraud a problem? Is it a feature, or is it a bug? Right. And I think many collectivists, it's actually a feature. Definitely. And we see that throughout history. And that's part of why, as sort of free market advocates, it's not just about efficiency. It's not just about productivity. It's about flourishing. It's also about justice. And I think in many cases, that's what people care about, right? And so what we're doing on this team, among other things, besides the detailed analysis, is trying to make that case that this is actually better for people and better for society from a moral standpoint, a flourishing standpoint, as well as an economic one. Well, thank you both for joining me. That was great. I look forward to chatting with you again in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Paul.
Yes.